Well, it's been a nasty campaign filled with racism and scaremongering, including the murder of an MP in the lead-up to today's UK referendum on EU membership. Certainly the result will not only affect the EU, but it will also affect the UK's own unity and stability. As Nicola Sturgeon says, Scottish independence will once again be brought to the fore if Brexit wins. Polls show an almost evenly divided electorate. In this edition of the debate, we discuss the effects of a win either way in today's referendum over whether the UK shall remain or leave the European Union. Let me now introduce our guests for this edition of the debate. We're joined by investigative journalist Mr. Tony Gosling, who is joining us live from Bristol. And we're also joined by EU affairs consultant Mr. Gary Cartwright, who is joining us live from Brussels. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us for this debate. Mr. Cartwright, I'll start with you. How do you assess the effect this referendum has already had, in fact, on the UK, especially considering, of course, polls showed an almost evenly divided electorate? Does this bode well for national unity?
That's a very good question. The first thing that I'd like to say is that the act of the referendum taking place itself is, I think, a great achievement. The fact that we have some 46.5 million people making their decision, the people deciding what is a very, very important constitutional decision. It's absolutely correct that this decision should be taken by the people. I'm absolutely 100% behind this concept and campaigned myself for a referendum for a long time. It does seem to have polarised opinion, and it's done it in an unpleasant way. We've seen not the most pleasant of campaigns. We've seen biased rhetoric on both sides. We've seen false arguments placed. And of course, to me, the victory of achieving this referendum has been completely ruined by the murder of Joe Cox.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, same question to you. How do you feel about this?
Well, I actually think the cut and thrust of debate, some people massaging the facts and others not, is actually quite good and for the health of the nation's education, really. I think it's been a pretty reasonable campaign, although I would say that the whole thing seems to have been framed almost by the Conservative Party, although there's lots of reasons why the left might want to exit from the European Union, particularly because of this massive centralisation of power, which no one has ever been asked about, has been going on. That's the thing, I think, which for me has not really struck home, is just how massively centralised the power now is right across Europe. We've got 500 million people in Europe. Also, one of the things that's not been talked about, surprisingly, is the fact that just last week, the Swiss, the sensible Swiss, they have just withdrawn their 1992 application to join the European Union. One of their MPs said only a few lunatics would want to join it now because it's such a basket case. The evolution of how this has happened really started after the Second World War, something called the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952. Then we had the European Economic Community, the Treaty of Rome in 1958. Which was really started by countries like Italy and West Germany, the Axis powers in the World War II. Then in 1973, Britain joined, although no one was actually asked whether Britain wanted to join the EEC in Britain. It was just done by the government. And we had a referendum in 1975 which agreed with that decision. Then Mrs. Thatcher started kicking back against what was trying to be imposed, which was this new thing called the European Union. And she was removed from power because she said famously, I refuse to hand over this sovereign nation to 13 unelected bankers, because that's the way she personally saw it. And she was removed from power. The most powerful, many would say, political leader tried to stop the integration of Britain, the loss of sovereignty into the EU, and she was removed. And then in 1992, after that, we had the guy that's now a director of the Carlyle group, I think he still is, these massive arms financing company, John Major, took over and brought Britain into the European Union. We're now in a situation where I've just been looking at interviewing some bloggers and researchers and lawyers from Germany, and they're saying that the EU is now passing legislation to allow privatisation not just of the infrastructure of countries in Europe, which are collapsing under debt, like countries like Greece, but they're now looking at legislation to allow the privatisation of the police, the privatisation of the civil service, and the privatisation of the army in some countries, except for Germany. So you can see where this is all going. One giant corporation running the lives of 500 million Europeans effectively a gigantic machine, and I don't think anybody wants to be part of this.
Let me put some of those points, if you allow me, Mr. Gosling, to Mr. Cartwright, because Mr. Cartwright, the question of sovereignty and the loss of sovereignty has been something that's been spoken about a lot throughout this campaign. How do you feel about that?
Well, obviously, as Tony said, Britain joined the then Common Market in 1973. I'm old enough to remember that debate just about, but I certainly wasn't old enough to vote in 1975. What people voted on in 75 was completely different to what the European Union has become today. That's absolutely beyond question. Is it a giant corporation in the making? That I would question, but it certainly is a federal state in the making. It has all the identities of a state. Loss of sovereignty. Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister who took Britain into the Common Market, stated clearly that this was a trading bloc and that there would be no loss of sovereignty. He subsequently, towards the end of his life, admitted that he had deceived the electorate. And that is why I think, given that we can clearly see a loss of sovereignty in so many areas of our daily lives, our economic life, our political life, this referendum is essential.
Okay, so let's talk about Scotland then, if we may, Mr. Gosling, because Nicola Sturgeon has come out and said that she does want to bring to the fore once again the talk of Scottish independence. How do you feel that would go, Mr. Gosling?
Well, I don't think Nicola is right in saying that Scotland is 100% for the EU. I think in many ways, many Scots will look at this situation as the lesser of two evils, that maybe Brussels is less bad than Westminster. And I think partly that's why it's not just Britain that's been talking about getting away from the EU. Obviously, the Greeks have had a similar vote last summer to do with the finance and the euro. But this is a natural reaction to failures at the top. We've seen failures by our politicians, failures in our media to properly cover these subjects, many of the most important issues simply not getting an airing in our London media and mainstream press. No real proper critique, for example, of foreign policy and the wars that have been going on in the Middle East, the overthrow, illegal wars in Iraq. We're talking about some war criminals, but Tony Blair is still walking the streets, and also the failures of the financiers, the money people. They have completely failed, and I think many people right across Europe, and in fact in other parts of the world, I've received quite a lot of messages from the US saying, please put a stop to this. Britain, vote, for a Brexit, and send a very clear message to Brussels that they can't carry on with this kind of monolithic machine that's starting to control all of our lives, but without any real input from ordinary people at all. And one of the things I always point out, which has hardly been mentioned in the debate here in Britain, is that the EU accounts have not been signed off almost ever since it was created back in the early 1990s. It's something like 22 years now. We've had no audited accounts for the whole of the European Union, all of the hundreds of billions of pounds that are spent. There's no way of tracing it, and the auditors just simply refuse to sign off the accounts. So effectively, we're dealing with a kind of lawless gang that spend what they want and are simply not accountable to ordinary members of the public at all.
Okay, so Mr. Cartwright, I wanted to get your opinion as well, of course, on Scotland. I also wanted to, in fact, ask you about the foreign policy issue that Mr. Gosling brought up, because many around the world are wondering, how does this EU referendum, this UK referendum on EU membership affect us, those of us outside of UK borders? Will this be a positive thing? Will the UK self-reflect on its foreign policy around the world?
I think that over the recent years, recent decades, the UK has forgotten who its friends and allies are. I think that we have allowed ourselves to become too far drawn into the EU when it comes to foreign policy. And that's going to get more and more so with the External Action Service, which of course is now taking on a lot of member states' diplomatic responsibilities and opening what it calls missions across the world, and those missions are effectively embassies in various countries, in many countries indeed. I would like to just to talk about the economic mess that the EU can be. I mentioned the External Action Service. When that actually kicked in, when that started operating, it was discovered that nobody had actually set up a budget for it. Money had to be wired from other budgets. That's very unprofessional, to say the least. Regarding the Court of Auditors, I did say at the beginning that there's been a lot of misinformation, and I would just like to put Tony correct on that, because that's an argument I hear a lot. You merely have to check the Court of Auditors website. They do sign off the accounts, but there is a perennial problem, and that is with virements, just as I've mentioned with the External Action Service. There is a lack of discipline on actually maintaining the integrity of the individual budget lines. We see things vired from one budget line to another. This causes the confusion, and that's what's led to the story about the accounts not being fully signed off.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, considering we're halfway through the debate, I wanted to also bring this up because many people have, when they reflect on this campaign, have called it, and I'm using a number of their words, racist, fear-mongering, xenophobic. Many of those words have come to the fore when we speak about either side's campaign. How do you feel about that, and what kind of an effect that has really had on the country, whichever way the vote really goes?
Well, okay, there's been, I think, an enormous attempt to smear those that criticise mass immigration into Britain. Effectively, it's been almost unlimited, with people who have residency rights and citizenship rights, residency mostly from outside the EU, all coming to Britain. We just heard literally in the last couple of days that now the migration rate is something like 500,000 a year, 500,000 extra people a year coming to Britain. I mean, I don't think Britain can cope with this flow from just a basic infrastructure point of view, but then it's also a serious problem when it comes to driving down pay and conditions and wages. We've now got a situation where many people who are in jobs have had their wages driven down. We've just seen on the high street, Marks and Spencers have been driving down wages of their staff just over the last week or so. An enormous decrease in wages, some thousands of pounds a year, some people are having to take in wages, and that's because there's a glut of lots and lots of cheap labour, and this is exactly what big business wants, and that's one of the reasons why there's been, I think, an enormous influx of people into Britain, because it suits big business. And also, of course, it keeps the housing bubble going too. So when I say that, I mean the house prices in Britain are grossly inflated. And it means it's very difficult for young people to actually get on the ladder. But it looks good on the figures. When George Osborne reads his figures out, he can say, oh, well, look, there's growth. A lot of that growth is simply coming from the property market, because property prices are becoming inflated by immigration. And I don't actually think there's been very much racist talk at all over here, but a very measured debate, which is saying, well, actually, unlimited migration is bad for the country. I mean, you mentioned earlier the death of the MP last week, and I was rather staggered that no comparisons were made between Joe Cox's murder and the murder back in 2003, exactly similar sorts of circumstances in the run-up to an EU referendum in Sweden, where the Swedish politician Anna Lindh was also murdered, and she had a kind of similar view, and it was supposed to be by a far-right person. Now, we can't say what this is behind this murder, but it certainly looks as if it's a similar kind of thing to Anna Lindh's killing, and yet no comparisons have been made at all here in the British media. And I'd just like to point that out, that needs to be part of the analysis if we're to take this seriously and look at the possible political implications of what's going on here, because nothing we see in our press and our media now, I think we're getting the full truth from the word go. We need to analyse these incidents and see if there's some other motive than that's being presented by the mainstream media.
Okay, Mr. Cartwright, that was certainly an interesting point that Mr. Gosling there made, because for many of the statements that have been made, it does seem like there is racism and xenophobia, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, as well, and if you agree with Mr. Gosling, go ahead.
Regarding the murder of Anna Lindh in Denmark, a figure who was very closely associated for many, many years with the UK Independence Party issued a statement after that murder saying that when the time comes, we hope that British patriots behave in the same way. And that's just a foretaste of what this campaign has degraded into. It seems to me that I'm talking mainly about the UK Independence Party now, because they've taken a lead on this issue for so long before Boris Johnson became involved, for example. But it seems to me when we look back on this campaign, we will see that when UKIP talk about economics, whether they talk about health, about education, everything is put into the context of migration. And as we all know, read the British papers, read the tabloids, EU equals migration, migration equals terrorism. That's the message that people have been given, and I think that's absolutely wrong. I think that has completely discoloured the whole debate.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, you were shaking your head there, and I wanted, of course, to get your reaction. Go ahead.
I agree that this is really quite a nasty side to all of this. It's almost as if there is people trying to cash in on the fact that we've got so many migrants to say, well, hang on, these people are, some of them anyway, are terrorists. I mean, for example, this attack on Joe Cox, the guy wasn't called a terrorist because he was apparently from the far right. And it seems that in Britain, it's official now. Craig Murray on his blog was saying this, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, that only Muslims can be terrorists. And that seems to be the way here in Britain. So there's obviously a racist side to all of that. But I think, you know, we've got also to remember that Ambrose Pritchard Evans has been writing some really good stuff in the Telegraph recently, explaining that actually it was the Central Intelligence Agency that began financing the whole European movement back in the 1950s, that wanted to bring all these 28 countries, or 30 countries, I think it was originally they wanted to do, under one roof, because the Americans found it very inconvenient dealing with all these different foreign embassies. And the whole idea of an EU was great because they could only speak to one embassy, one organisation, and tell them what to do, rather than trying to get scores of different embassies in Europe to agree. And there's lots of evidence for the financing by people like William Donovan and Alan Dulles in the 1950s. Dulles, of course, was linked to the movement of Nazis and Operation Paperclip into the United States, a very dodgy character, and the laundering of ex-Nazi money. And these people were definitely behind the funding of the original European movement, which got the whole EU thing going in the first place, which is now the EU, and also were behind the Bilderberg conferences, which happened a week ago when I was over in Germany. These people have also been behind the scenes creating this federal United States of Europe, which, you know, it looks like 500 million people compared to the United States of America, which is a comparatively small 320 million. And those two United States, it seems to me, are now working in concert together on foreign policy and see themselves as a massive superpower bloc. I think the people of Britain have had enough of this, and my honest opinion is I think that we'll probably vote out, but we'll see by the morning.
Okay, one more point I wanted to get to, if you allow me, gentlemen, is a poll that was done for the Electoral Reform Society, the ERS, and I'm just going to quote Mr. Cartwright what that poll showed. 71% of wealthier Brits say they will vote, compared to just 62% of those who are from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. And this last part is what's most disturbing, according to ERS, is that only half of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they would vote. Now, ERS's own director then said that's very concerning because that means that this debate over EU membership will not be closed with this referendum, but may come back at some point in the future. Do you agree with that?
If Britain decides to stay in the EU, I don't think that this should be permanently closed. I think that this should be revisited at some point in the future, maybe in 10 years, but that's for others to decide. You talk about the disappointing number of people who will be voting, particularly the younger groups, but that's absolutely normal. Every time we have a general election, or if we have local elections, if we have European elections, afterwards people shake their heads at the very poor turnout. That's absolutely normal.
Okay, and Mr. Gosling, I wanted to get your opinion on that.
I regret that, but it's the case.
Mr. Gosling, I wanted to get your opinion as well on that poll.
Well, yeah, I think there's lots of young people in Britain that feel disenfranchised. Actually, my reading of today's, looking at some of the articles, like literally this afternoon, just a couple of hours ago, it looks like the turnout for this vote will be one of the largest ever in Britain. And you know what? That, I think, signals something positive, that this is a real referendum we're having. Because the thing is, when you're living as a sort of small sub-state from the EU, being run from Brussels, what's happened over the years is our general elections that we have every 4 or 5 years have just been meaning less and less. And that has just made people feel there's no point in voting when they're voting for a Tony Blair who's trying to be more Thatcherite than Margaret Thatcher. And it's quite understandable. People think, well, there's no point in voting because the only parties that can get into power all basically singing from the same City of London-led hymn sheet. You know, this is what's been going on in the last 20 or 30 years here. So people have realised, I think also now the Labour Party has become kind of reinvigorated by the election of Jeremy Corbyn. So it's more its old Labour roots. So there is a bit more of a point in voting in general elections from now on. But this particular vote, I think, is probably the most important vote, the referendum today, with most of our lifetimes, you know, certainly for the last 40 years, which will make a big difference over the future. And I think maybe young people are staying away simply because they think, well, maybe we'll leave this to the older generation. And I can tell you, most of the older generation, including Second World War veterans that are still alive, will almost all be voting to get out of the EU, because that's basically the way they think. If you go to the British legions across this country, many of them say, well, the EU has been a disaster. Maybe the youngsters are just leaving it to the sort of the veterans, the elders of society, to make this decision.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there at that point, gentlemen, but of course we do appreciate both of your contributions to this edition of the debate. That was investigative journalist Mr. Tony Gosling, who was speaking to us live from Bristol, and we were also joined by EU affairs consultant Mr. Gary Cartwright, who was speaking to us live from Brussels. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.